My daughter-in-law kicked me out of the house after my son died. But at the will reading, losing my only son was already the most devastating pain of my life. But nothing prepared me for what came the day after the funeral. With no time to breathe, I was shocked by my daughter-in-law's coldness, leaving me on the sidewalk with few bags and no comfort. I felt as if I had lost not only my son but also my place in the world. But life, even silent, has its own ways of revealing the truth. And it was only when I received an unexpected summons for the will reading that I realized not all was lost. What I found from there led me on a journey of pain, revelations, and above all reconstruction. Today, at 67 years old, I carry deep scars, but also a strength no one else can take from me. I'm incredibly happy to have you here. Follow my story to the end and tell me in the comments what city you're following from. I want to know how far my truth can reach. The wake had ended a few hours ago, but the morning seemed to be just beginning. David was my only son, and burying him was like burying the most alive part of me. The room still smelled of funeral flowers, but what hurt most was the silence between Stephanie and me. She didn't exchange a word with me after the burial. She kept her gaze fixed on anything but my direction, as if I had ceased to exist. I tried to break that silence out of politeness, out of humanity perhaps. "I need some tea," I murmured, hoping for some gesture of kindness. She nodded wordlessly and left the kitchen. When I returned, my cup was there, but she was no longer in the house. I was left alone, cup in hand, wondering if that would be my last tea in that kitchen where David grew up. The house seemed strange, almost hostile, as if it had taken on the new owner's grievances. Hours later, Stephanie returned. She didn't ask if I needed anything. She just glanced at me and went upstairs. When I came down, it was past 10 at night. "Stephanie," I called, still with respect. She turned slowly, not hiding her boredom. "Early tomorrow morning I need you to leave. I don't think it's appropriate for you to stay here." My body froze. She spoke as if we were discussing any guest, not the deceased's mother. I tried to hide the trembling of my hands. "Just one more night," I pleaded with dignity. But she only looked away and whispered, "It would be better if you didn't." The pain of mourning mixed with the humiliation of being treated as an inconvenience. At that moment I didn't cry, nor did I raise my voice. I went back to the room where I had slept so many nights in peaceful times. But now that room no longer belonged to me, and she made no effort to hide it. "We need to talk." Morning arrived silent and gray. I slowly descended the stairs, my heart heavy, unsure how to face this new day. Stephanie was already in the living room, dressed and poised, as if David's death was just a convenient end. Beside me, sealed boxes piled up memories. Books, frames, clothes folded in haste. My heart broke before those boxes. I hadn't even had time to touch some of them. "It's all here. I've already sorted your things," she said with a voice too practical for the moment. I looked at the boxes and then at her. No trace of empathy. "You can't be serious." She shrugged. "The house is mine now. And I think David would agree." His name on her lips made me nauseous. How can someone who just lost her husband be so precise, so quick, so functional? I collected the objects in silence. I touched each one with affection, as if bidding them farewell forever. There were childhood letters, picture frames, the scarf I made for David when he was 12. With each item, memories returned, but I swallowed them. I didn't want to give Stephanie the pleasure of seeing my tears. She remained standing, arms crossed, watching as if I were cleaning a room she wanted to forget. As I closed the last box, she approached. "Don't take this personally, Eleanor. David made it clear he wanted me to have everything. Implicitly, of course. But it was his wish." I wanted to scream, but I took a deep breath. "David would never kick me out of this house." She smiled coldly. "He trusted I would do what was right." That comment echoed in my mind like an uncomfortable shadow. What if she was lying? What if? I dragged my bags to the door with the same dignity with which I entered that house years ago. The difference is that now I left invisible. When I stepped onto the sidewalk, the world felt heavier. The house behind me closed like a tomb. The rideshare car arrived. The driver didn't even get out. I put the bags in the trunk with effort. And I got in with a void larger than what fit inside my chest. "Those are David's orders." Implicit. The rain started fine, like a whisper. then thickened in minutes. From the back seat of the car, I watched the drops accumulate on the glass, blurring the streetlights. Every face that passed seemed distant, oblivious to the pain I carried. The suitcase beside me was simple, but the weight it carried inside was immeasurable. My grief still had no space to settle. I hadn't even begun to process David's absence. I clutched the crucifix around my neck and leaned my head against the cold glass. A tightness in my stomach overwhelmed me, as if something was out of place, and it wasn't just the fact of being kicked out. It was as if David still wanted to tell me something I hadn't had time to hear. His last weeks were strangely calm, almost methodical, and now all of it made even less sense. I remembered the times David told me, "Trust me, Mom. In the end it will work out." That seemed strange at the time. Now it felt like a warning, a code, a promise embedded in layers of silence. I looked out the window and saw the city blurred by the raindrops. Everything in me wanted to believe that this wouldn't end like this. That this wasn't the last page of the story I wrote with my son. The car drove through streets I knew well, but which now seemed foreign. My heart, once shaped to be a home, was now a forgotten suitcase. I thought of Helen, my sister, and how she would react to hearing everything. But above all, I thought of David. He was too kind to allow this. Something told me that this hasty departure was not the end. Perhaps it was just the beginning of something much bigger. What did David really want? The hotel room smelled of cheap bleach and loneliness. The short curtains let in a sliver of gray light, just enough to reveal the coldness of the walls. I sat on the edge of the bed, hugging my coat as if it could offer me some comfort. Memories of David surfaced like waves, intense, unexpected, overwhelming. And amidst the pain, the feeling that something was very wrong with all of it. I replayed the last few months in my memory. David was restless, more present in conversations, but also reserved. He talked a lot about preparing for anything, as if he wanted to leave me at peace with something unsaid. Stephanie, in contrast, seemed calculating even in her grief. Her behavior after the funeral wasn't just cold. It was rehearsed, as if she had been waiting for that moment for years. And maybe she had. I picked up my old notebook, where I jotted down thoughts and phrases from David. In one of them he had written, "The most important truths need time and silence to be born." Those words now seemed like a riddle, a code left for me. I could no longer ignore the intuition that David had left me something. A last gesture of love. A way out, a resource, a form of justice. I stood up and looked at myself in the blurred mirror. The woman looking back at me was not weak, nor defeated. She was a mother on the verge of a revelation. "He wouldn't leave me like this," I murmured. There was something more. Something that needed to be discovered. And then, for the first time since the funeral, I let a seed of doubt blossom between the pain and the longing. David had left clues. Will there be a will reading? Helen arrived in the early afternoon, her eyes tear-filled and her hands full of bags. "You've been in this hotel since yesterday?" she asked, as if wanting to confirm something her heart refused to accept. I nodded in silence. The shock in her eyes was immediate. "This is inhumane. That woman kicking you out like this. No, this isn't going to stand." I sat beside her and just listened. For the first time I felt welcomed. "You need to contact David's lawyer. There must be something official. A will." He wasn't the type to leave everything in her hands. Her words made sense. David was organized, meticulous. He always thought 3 steps ahead. Remember when he mentioned something about a safe deposit box? I thought it was strange at the time. But now everything seems to fit. My heart leaped, as if the pieces of a puzzle were beginning to move. I asked her to repeat. "A safe deposit box?" Helen nodded. "Yes." He said something like, "Not everything will be visible." I thought it was about investments. I started taking notes again, now with determination. There was more to this grief than Stephanie wanted me to believe. And David somehow had left clues. I needed to follow them, even if it meant revisiting every memory with surgical precision. Helen squeezed my hand. "You're not alone, Eleanor. This story isn't over yet." For the first time since it all began, I felt something other than grief. A spark of purpose. I stood up. If David left me a trail, I would follow it to the end. And with luck, I would find justice where now there was only pain. There was a thread pulling this story back to me. He mentioned a safe deposit box in a conversation, remember? As night fell, the phone in the room rang. The sound was sharp, unexpected, like a call of destiny. I answered with a voice still trembling, expecting anything but what I heard. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore? This is James Morrison, your son's lawyer. My heart stopped for an instant. You have been named a direct beneficiary in David's will. I need you to attend the reading. I was speechless for a few seconds. But Stephanie said that. He interrupted gently. You are officially listed. Your presence is mandatory. That changed everything. The house, the boxes, the expulsion, the silence now seemed part of a staged act. David had left something just for me. And Stephanie wasn't counting on it. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. The story was just beginning. David left something. Just for you. The lawyer's building had an old but elegant facade, the kind that commands respect without shouting. My steps hesitated with each stair, as if my presence there was a mistake. When the receptionist led me to the room, the air grew denser. Stephanie sat with her legs crossed, impeccable, and beside her Marcus, the brother who never gave me a decent look. When I entered, he let out a dry chuckle. She looked at me over her shoulder, her lips thin as razors. I didn't think you'd have the nerve to come. I sat down without answering, keeping my gaze firm. Inside, my soul trembled, but I learned early that maintaining composure is dignity's last refuge. Marcus whispered something to his sister, who smiled sarcastically. It didn't matter. I wasn't there for them, I was there for David. James Morrison entered with a thick folder in his hands and a serious demeanor. He greeted everyone neutrally, then gave me a respectful look. We are here to read the will left by David Whitmore. I ask that you do not interrupt. Silence settled. My son's name sounded different coming from a stranger's mouth. Still, each syllable seemed to light a candle within me, illuminating what strength remained. He began reading. Stephanie would inherit the house, movable assets, joint accounts, and some investments. Marcus was mentioned with a symbolic amount. Up to that point, everything seemed to confirm her control over everything. But then, James turned the page and looked at me with renewed seriousness. There is a final clause. Stephanie straightened in her chair. A bank safe deposit box reserved exclusively for the testator's mother, with exclusive legal access. Exclusive access. Stephanie's eyes widened, then her lips tightened as she tried to regain control. What safe deposit box is that? She asked, as if the lawyer were making a mistake. James remained impassive. It's an express instruction. The testator determined that only Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore may access the contents. Marcus coughed lightly, disconcerted. For the first time, Stephanie seemed genuinely uncomfortable. This is absurd, she said, her tone already changing. James remained calm. There is no room for interpretation. I have written and legally registered orders. She still tried to protest. David never told me about this. James stared at her. Precisely why it was included this way. I didn't know what was in the safe deposit box, but its mere existence was a gesture, a recognition, an answer I hadn't had time to receive in life. My hands were sweating, but I gripped my purse firmly. Stephanie's gaze now shifted between anger and fear. She knew this threatened the narrative she had constructed since the funeral. Eleanor didn't even live with him anymore. This is unfair. James interrupted her elegantly. This is legal. And it was the testator's express wish. Marcus looked away. For the first time, I noticed a crack in their silent pact. James then pulled out a blue envelope sealed with wax. Here are the banking instructions, Mrs. Whitmore. You have 3 days to go to the indicated branch and access the contents. After this period, the safe deposit box will be judicially sealed, and no changes can be made. My heart raced. 3 days. 3 days to discover what my son had hidden from the world, and most importantly from Stephanie. 3 days to go to the bank. I arrived at the bank with the envelope in my hands, my heart racing and my soul in suspense. Beside me, like an annoying shadow, Stephanie followed, uninvited. You're not going in alone, she said, as if she could decide that. We entered the lobby, and manager Ruth Salinger came to meet us. There was firmness in her gaze, as if she knew exactly the kind of visit that brought us there. I presented the envelope. Ruth examined it carefully, then looked at Stephanie. "You are not listed as authorized." Stephanie scoffed. "I'm his widow. I have a right to know." Ruth replied with chilling calm. "The testator specified exclusive access to Mrs. Whitmore. The bank merely complies with legality." Stephanie blushed. "You're making a mistake." Ruth remained serene. "The mistake would be to disregard a registered will." Stephanie backed away, but not before giving me a look that mixed venom and surprise. Ruth gestured for me to follow her. We crossed long, silent corridors until we reached an armored door. Ruth typed codes with precision. The metallic sound of the lock releasing access made my body tremble. For the first time in many days, I felt that David was still with me, guiding me. We entered a small room with gray walls and a table in the center. Ruth pointed to a chair. "Sit down. This might take a while." I sat. She remained silent for a few minutes, just observing me. Finally, she said, "Your son came here every month. Always on the same day. Always alone." That sentence touched me deeply. The frequency was the detail I needed to understand that nothing there was impulsive, it was preparation. David came here every month. I opened the safe deposit box with trembling hands. Inside were a brown folder, a notebook, and a carefully folded letter. Nothing else. I gently took the letter and pressed it against my chest before opening it. I knew it would be difficult to read it there, but I couldn't wait. I unfolded the paper and read the first sentence. "If you're reading this, Mom, it's because my plan worked." The world stopped. David was still there, between those lines written in his firm handwriting. The folder contained documents, sealed and labeled with dates. The notebook held bank annotations, deposit records. Everything perfectly organized. I took each item with reverence, trying to absorb what it meant. He had foreseen everything, even Stephanie's coldness. And in silence, he had built a refuge for me. Silent tears fell as I read the beginning of the letter. He explained that he didn't trust Stephanie, and that in recent years he had been setting aside resources. "This money is yours, Mom. You gave me everything when I had nothing. Now it's my turn." Each sentence was a belated hug, a form of love that not even death could prevent. Ruth watched me respectfully, unhurriedly, not invading my moment. When I finished, I closed the safe deposit box and stood up. The pain of grief was still there, but now mixed with something more powerful: clarity. David had prepared me for that moment. And now I understood, Stephanie was not the end of the story. She was just the obstacle between pain and truth. "If you're reading this, it's because my plan worked." The letter began tenderly, but each line carried the force of unwavering love. David explained how, 5 years earlier, I had given him $40,000 with trepidation and trust. "You gave me the foundation, Mom," he wrote, "and I made it a shelter for you." Through investments, savings, and meticulous decisions, he transformed that amount into $185,000. But there was more. He documented everything. David precisely recounted the moments he noticed Stephanie's manipulation. Small comments, possessive attitudes, silent restrictions. "She tried to gradually distance me from you. It started with words, ended with silence." Each paragraph was like opening a window to a past I already suspected but never had the courage to confront. David saw everything, and he acted in silence. He mentioned dates, places, and even specific conversations. He kept screenshots, email records, and suspicious bank transfers made by Stephanie. "I knew that if I left first, she would try to erase you from history." The words made me tremble. David had anticipated the darkness. He had faced it alone to protect me. And now, even absent, he handed me armor. I finished the letter with silent tears. But, for the first time, they were not just of sadness, they were also of recognition. My son had seen me. He had loved me with actions. He had kept every step, every proof, every detail, not for revenge but out of care. I folded the letter with reverence and held it to my chest, like someone receiving a second chance to be heard. "She will not destroy you." I opened the folder with steady hands. There was the evidence. Dates, transactions, screenshots. Everything organized with meticulous precision. David had printed emails in which Stephanie discussed ways to transfer assets, while he was still alive, to her exclusive name. There were records of visits to the lawyer without his knowledge, And even messages exchanged with Marcus talking about acting before the old woman gets in the way. I read each page with a burning heart, but without allowing myself to collapse. The truth gave me strength. I wasn't crazy. I was never fragile, I was silenced. And now, finally, I held the answer to years of estrangement and distancing. The reality was even more perverse than I imagined, but also clearer than it had ever been. Stephanie had planned everything with surgical coldness. In one of the documents, David left direct instructions. If she tries to stop you, show this. The truth is here. His clarity impressed me. He had foreseen every one of her steps, including the attempt at manipulation after his death. The money was important, yes, but it was the gesture of trust that strengthened me the most. He not only protected me, he armed me with the truth. I closed the folder carefully, like someone sealing a powerful secret. There was more than just proof. There was a silent declaration of love. That safe deposit box was more than a bank deposit. It was a sanctuary, a legacy of resistance. And within me something began to change. It was no longer just pain. It was focus. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I would no longer be silenced. She had been planning this for years. Ruth remained by my side in respectful silence, simply observing my process. When I put everything in my bag, she calmly stood up. Your son was consistent. He came here every month religiously. There was a contained pride in her voice, like someone sharing a precious secret. He never told me exactly what he kept, but I knew it was important. He looked at that safe deposit box with reverence. Those words touched me deeply. Ruth was not just a bank manager. She was a silent witness to David's courage. He was kind, she said, but firm. You could see he did it with purpose. I nodded, emotional. It was comforting to know that my son was not alone in his preparation. Someone else had noticed the greatness of what he did in silence. As we left the room, the hallway light seemed different. It now carried a discreet but present glow, the kind of glow that only comes from truth. Ruth stopped at the main door and held my arm for an instant. What you found there has value. Don't waste it. I nodded with tear-filled eyes. I wouldn't waste it. Not for her. Not for me. Not for David. On the street, I took a deep breath and looked up at the cloudy sky. There was no sun, but there were no more shadows either. I carried with me the letter, the documents, the silence, and the strength of someone who has already lost everything, and still refuses to be defeated. Stephanie thought she had erased me, but little did she know, what was to come would be definitive, and I wouldn't need to raise my voice. She will hear everything. 2 days later, I received a message from Stephanie. Short, objective, with an appearance of cordiality that didn't convince even the cell phone. We need to talk. Shall we have lunch? The proposal sounded like a trap, but I accepted. I wanted to look her in the eyes with the firmness my son had taught me. I replied, accepted. Tomorrow 12:30 p.m. at the restaurant on the corner of York Street. She confirmed almost immediately. On the morning of the meeting, I prepared as if for battle. I placed the letter and documents in a discreet folder. Helen looked at me before I left and asked, "Are you sure about this?" I smiled. She needs to know she lost. On the way, I mentally repeated the phrases I didn't need to shout. It was silence that would strengthen me, and this time there would be no room for manipulation. Upon arrival, she was already seated. Elegant, well posed, but with the artificial glow of someone trying to dominate. "Thank you for coming," she said with a false smile. "Let's talk like adults. No papers or accusations, okay?" I sat down calmly. Of course. Just talk. But she didn't know that silence is the sharpest weapon when you carry the truth in your pocket. She ordered a salad as she always did and smiled as she spoke. "We don't need to fight, Eleanor. We can find a middle ground. Combine resources. You know, be fair to each other." I remained silent. "We can sell part of the house and split it. Or open a fund for works in David's name. Something symbolic." I remained quiet, just watching the act unfold. Every word was an effort to maintain control. "Don't bring documents. Let's just talk." "Are you listening to me?" she asked, impatient. I nodded, still not answering. Stephanie seemed uncomfortable with my lack of reaction. The absence of my visible pain disoriented her. Eleanor, this doesn't have to be a war. Aren't you tired? We can resolve everything without resentment. Her tone was sweet, but her eyes remained hard, like ice disguised as sugar. I let her talk for minutes, explaining plans, proposing agreements, rehearsing empathy. She spoke of mourning loss, the supposed longing she felt for David. But no tears fell. No tremor in her voice. Only calculations. Only control. Inside I wondered, how could I have been deceived for so long? But now the lost time no longer mattered. What mattered was what I would do with what remained. I can help you, Eleanor. We can take care of each other as he would have wanted. That sentence was the final straw. The hypocrisy overflowed from the mouth that had kicked me out 2 days after burying my son. It was time. I picked up the folder beside me and placed it on the table, without saying a word. The sound of the clasp opening echoed between us like a drum. Stephanie froze. I took out the letter. Then the documents. I slid everything towards her. Do you know what this is? I asked, finally breaking the silence. She paled. David knew, I added. And he kept everything. Her eyes scanned the pages, and the blood drained from her face. For the first time, Stephanie had no answer. Only the weight of the truth before her. Are you listening to me? She closed the folder with trembling hands and tried to smile, but the mask had already cracked. This could be misinterpreted. I leaned slightly forward. Nothing here is open to interpretation. It's all literal, legal, true. She started to say something but choked on her own words. Her eyes searched for refuge on the restaurant walls, but found no escape. The waiter approached. More water, ladies? Stephanie shook her head. I asked for a glass. The silence between us was more eloquent than any speech. She still tried to regain control. You don't want to expose all this, do you? You'll end up tarnishing his name too. I looked at her directly. David already cleared his name before he left. He just forgot to clear yours. I stood up with the calmness of someone who no longer needed to fight. She remained seated, her fingers clenched on the edge of the table. You're not going to do this to me. I looked at her one last time. I didn't do anything. You did everything yourself. I left the restaurant without haste. The sun was shining outside. And for the first time it was shining for me. You underestimated the wrong person. She sought me out 3 days after lunch. This time there was no restaurant invitation, no friendly tone. She called me to talk in the garden of the house that was no longer mine, as if she wanted to rewrite history. When I arrived, she was nervous, her nails bitten, her hair loosely tied. This is all a big misunderstanding, Eleanor. David wasn't good at dealing with conflicts. I knew what she was getting at. You pressured him. He felt guilty about everything. He always came back from meetings with you more tense. Her eyes filled with tears, but it was also artificial. It almost hurt to watch. You emotionally manipulated him. He was afraid of hurting you. He didn't tell you certain things out of pity. The accusation was harsh but empty. I let her speak. Every word of hers was a desperate attempt to erase what David had written with so much effort. You read what you wanted to read. You interpreted it as you wished. But he loved me. He wanted this house with me. With me, Eleanor. She clutched the necklace around her neck, trying to appear fragile. But her voice trembled not from pain, but from loss of control. She was losing the narrative, the dominance, and that terrified her more than any truth. Finally, through gritted teeth, she whispered. He feared you. That's why he was silent. He feared you. I remained firm, standing like a tree that has faced all storms. I took the bank statements with David's monthly deposits from my purse. I pointed out the dates. Here it is. Every cent came from him. It wasn't a secret. It was protection. I also placed the letter on the garden table. He wrote this himself. He kept it for years. You weren't deceived, Stephanie. You were observed. She tried to interrupt me, but I raised my hand without raising my voice. You cannot erase what is written, nor what is registered. David saw everything, and he acted like a man who loves in silence. It wasn't me who manipulated. It was he who planned. And now there's no way to undo it. She paled, her eyes wide, unable to find an argument. The puppet master had lost her strings. He knew what you were, I whispered. And he prepared everything for when you revealed your true face. Her gaze blurred, as if her mask was about to fall. You built everything on the idea that he wouldn't say anything. But he did. Only on paper. In code. In silence. I took a step forward. You tried to erase me. And it was he who illuminated you. The silence between us was deafening. There was no more room for manipulation. There were no more loopholes for justifications. For the first time, Stephanie seemed to shrink small before me. And I didn't need to shout. I just needed to keep showing the truth she had tried to hide for so long. It was the end of a game she thought she was playing alone. He knew what you were. How much did he leave? She asked suddenly, her voice dry. I stared at her for an instant, then replied, $185,000. The glass in her hand shattered like crystal struck by a cutting truth. Shards fell onto the stone garden floor. She wasn't physically hurt, but her soul bled uncontrollably. That was more than money. It was proof that David had chosen to trust me. She trembled. Her eyes scanned the garden, as if searching for an exit, a denial, a loophole to escape defeat. He deceived me, she whispered. I should have known. I should have suspected those outings of his. That silence. The necklace slipped from her fingers. She now looked like an actress off stage, without light, without script, without an audience. Only with the echo of her own charade. I knelt down, picked up the pieces of the glass with a tissue, and placed them on the table. This is what's left when you try to control everything with lies. She was about to say something, but there were no more words that fit there. Defeat did not come with shouts, but with the absence of defense. Truth hung like a sentence. I slowly stood up. I looked at the house where I raised my son, where I was erased, and where I was now reborn in dignity. You dug this abyss, Stephanie. And he built the bridge I used to come back. I turned my back to her. As I walked towards the gate, I heard her crying. But it wasn't grief, it was loss of control. And this time she would lose everything. This is what you wanted, wasn't it? The next day, Stephanie went to James's office. She hoped, perhaps, that a final eloquent speech could reverse the inevitable. But what she found was firmness and closed doors. James was direct. The safe deposit box is legally inviolable. You have no right to it. She still tried to argue. This was built with his money. It was ours. He held up a paper and calmly pointed. The records prove that the amounts were separated before the marriage, and that Mr. David declared it as an exclusive family donation. She was speechless. She still tried to allege David's emotional instability, but James merely pointed to the clause that shielded the content. He even foresaw attempts at legal challenge. The room seemed to shrink for Stephanie. Her pride, so inflated until days ago, now shriveled under the cold eyes of the law. James crossed his arms and said, "This was hermetically prepared. There are no loopholes." He knew who he was dealing with. Hearing this, she let the papers fall. She left the office through the same door where she once thought she dominated everything. Now she was just another one of many lost cases. On the sidewalk, her steps faltered. Her high heels stumbled on the cracks in the pavement, as if the world was pushing her out of the story. Stephanie was still rich, still had the house, but she had lost something much more precious, the narrative. The truth now walked free, in the hands of the one she tried to silence. And all the control in the world couldn't change that. This was hermetically prepared. The news of the failed attempt reached Marcus, who went to see her at the end of the day. The two had always formed an alliance of convenience. He pretended to support, she pretended to include. But that theater now crumbled before the exposure. "You went too far," he said upon entering. Stephanie, slumped on the couch, replied with disdain. "Don't start, Marcus. You benefited from this as much as I did." He didn't back down. "But I didn't destroy anyone in the process. You humiliated David's mother. You kicked her out the day after the funeral. Did you think no one would notice?" The anger in his eyes wasn't heroic, it was fear. He knew his name might be in the documents, and now he wanted to distance himself from the impending fall. Stephanie tried to justify herself, but he just shook his head. "The whole town is talking. Even the neighbors are talking. This is going to consume you, Stephanie." She stood up, agitated. "They always envied me. Always. But I'm strong. I have proof, I have rights. Marcus turned around. You had power. Now you only have scandal. The sound of the door slamming echoed through the empty house. It was the sound of an alliance breaking apart. Stephanie was left alone in the dark living room. The woman who meticulously articulated everything now stumbled in her own shadows. The furniture seemed larger, the walls narrower. For the first time she felt what it was like to be ignored, discredited, powerless. There was no one left to share the blame with. No one to defend her. She was alone. And beginning to understand what that meant. Everyone is seeing it now. Back in my hotel room, I laid my head on the pillow for the first time without tears. The mattress was still thin, the room still simple, but there was a peace there I hadn't felt in a long time. The safe deposit box, the letter, the truth, everything had been revealed. And contrary to what Stephanie expected, I didn't destroy anyone. I simply survived. And surviving sometimes is the most powerful form of justice. Helen stopped by to visit me. We exchanged few words. There was nothing more to explain. She brought me a sprig of lavender and an envelope with a key. The little house in Willow Creek is still available, remember? We can go see it tomorrow. I smiled. The idea of starting over in peace, without battles, without resentment, sounded like a precious gift. Yes. It's time. I dined alone, with the radio playing softly and David's letter on the table. I recalled every word. His love was meticulous, silent but profound. The pain of loss still existed and always will. But now it was no longer mixed with injustice. Now it was just clean longing. And that was bearable. That I could carry with dignity. I turned off the light and closed my eyes. The night was silent, without interruptions, without noises from the past accusing me. For the first time in weeks I slept deeply. David was with me. And I finally was with the truth. Tomorrow another stage would begin. A new life. Not the one I dreamed of, but the one I conquered in silence. Tomorrow I'm leaving. But with dignity. I visited Helen on Sunday morning. She was preparing tea with lemon cake, just like in the days when everything was simpler. We sat on the porch, our hands joined on the wooden table. I did it, I said with a shy smile. I'm going to start over. In another place with a different routine, with more quiet and less fear. Helen smiled back, her eyes moist with discreet pride. David would be so proud of you, she said, squeezing my hand. You went through hell with your head held high. I nodded. There was no victory without loss, but there was also no loss without purpose. His letter still rested with me, like a compass and comfort. His voice still echoed within me, serene, guiding me even in his absence. He taught me something more valuable than resisting. He taught me to prepare, not to retaliate. The words came out like a revelation. Helen smiled. You never needed to attack to win. You just needed to exist with truth. We drank our tea in silence, savoring not only the taste of the cake, but the newly found peace. For the first time, the future didn't look like a minefield, but a clear road. And I finally knew where I wanted to go. The farewell was calm. A long, deep hug, from sisters who had survived chaos. Helen remained on the porch waving to me. Small in the distance, immense in her presence. In my pocket I carried more than just papers and decisions. I carried what was left of me, the best of me. And for the first time that was enough. I would leave, yes, but without the weight of what was left behind. He taught me to prepare, not to retaliate. On Tuesday, Stephanie was seen leaving the bank in tears. She carried a folder and a broken face. She was no longer the firm woman, with a confident voice and strong steps. She was just what remained of someone who believed she could control everything. The bank had denied a new review request. Ruth, as firm as ever, had simply repeated, "The contents of the safe deposit box cannot be altered. It was never yours." The streets were abuzz. The neighbor on the corner whispered to the newspaper seller, "It seems the widow lost something." And he replied, "Maybe she lost everything." The words circulated like wind, passing through windows and cafes. The woman who once dominated social circles now faced judgmental glances. But the worst was not the shame. It was the end of her dominance. Stephanie had lost control. Not over her assets but over her image. The city, once a silent accomplice to her charm, now saw the cracks. and no one wanted to be associated with a poorly told story anymore. She tried to recompose herself, but stumbled over her own arrogance. Alone finally, like so many she had tried to isolate. And me? I just watched from afar. I didn't need to expose anything. The truth walked alone, without the need for a spectacle, for a loud voice, for revenge. Silent justice is that which doesn't seek a stage, only consequences. And there, before her fragility, I understood. I didn't win by being stronger. I won by not losing myself. She lost control. The following week, an envelope arrived in my hotel room. It was discreet, with the seal of James Morrison's office. I opened it calmly, and inside was a complete copy of the will. But what touched me most were the attached notes. David had left small observations next to each clause. Personal comments, almost intimate. It was like hearing his voice explaining each choice. Next to the safe deposit box item he had written, "Mom, this is all yours. For everything." A lump tightened in my throat. The following pages contained dates, details, and finally a handwritten sentence. "You were always the foundation. Now it's time to build the top." That completely broke me inside. He trusted me so much even when I doubted myself. The notes were not just explanations, they were tributes. Small pieces of love left at strategic points on the paper. I read each line slowly, like someone reading a will of the soul, not of possessions. And I finally understood the extent of his preparation. David didn't just leave money. He left dignity. He left continuity. I closed the envelope gently and put it among my books. The battle was over. There was no blood. There was no declared war. But there was victory. A silent, precise, definitive victory, made of patience, truth, and love. And all of that fit into just one sentence. You won. Without saying a word. I bought a small house in Willow Creek. It wasn't big nor modern, but it had a sunny garden, a wooden porch, and fertile ground to plant flowers and memories. The neighbors were friendly, discreet, and didn't ask questions. Here I found what I hadn't had in many years. Peace without surveillance, time without hurry, life without noise. I organized my belongings carefully. Each book had its place. David's letter stayed in a wooden box on the dresser. In the afternoons I would sit in the backyard and plant lavenders, sunflowers, rosemary. The earth responded as if welcoming me. I smiled at each sprout as if I were rediscovering my son in green pieces. It wasn't grief, it was rebirth. Helen came to visit and took a seedling home. We talked under the soft morning sun, and for the first time we laughed without melancholy. Here I lacked nothing, I told her. And it was true. There was no more dispute. No more explanations to be given. The past had completed its cycle, and the future welcomed me with clean arms. Finally, I could simply exist. The nights were long, yes, but they were not lonely. With a book in my lap, a cup of tea, and the chirping of crickets, I learned to love the silence. It wasn't an absence of sound, it was a presence of peace. And that, perhaps, was the greatest inheritance David left me. The certainty that the world can still be kind when we choose not to give up. Here I lacked nothing. One afternoon, while tending to the flowers, a young man approached the gate. He held a notebook and had a shy smile. "Excuse me for bothering you. Are you Eleanor Whitmore?" I nodded, curious. "I'm an economics student. I heard you understand investments. I thought perhaps you could guide me." I looked at him as if seeing a seed, and I decided to water it. I invited him in. I prepared some tea and asked about his ideas. He spoke with enthusiasm, but also with uncertainties. I remembered David, his careful youth, his silent faith in things well done. I stood up, went to my room, and returned with an envelope. "It's all here. Read it carefully. And never use money as a shield. Use it as a tool." His eyes widened in surprise. "Are you sure?" I nodded. "Teach the good ones. Protect yourself from the bad ones. And never forget. Silence protects more than words when you are right." He left with a future in his hands. And I, with the certainty that my story had planted a seed. Justice does not end, it transforms. And it multiplies. I returned to the garden with my hands still full of earth. The flowers smiled up at the sky, and I to myself. For the first time, everything made sense. The pain, the path, the losses, the choices. I sat on the porch and held David's photo. "Thank you, son," I murmured with a firm voice. He wasn't there. But his work, yes. Alive. Silent. Justice is a flower that blooms in silence. Now, I'm curious about you who have heard my story. What would you do if you were in my shoes? Have you experienced something similar? Support the channel. Subscribe, like, comment, and share this video. I'm leaving another story on the final screen that you'll also enjoy, and it will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.